Welcome, guys. I'm Vulture Culture, and tonight we're going to be answering the question, how do analog synthesizers work? How do you use an analog synthesizer, and how do you make your own sounds? So I'm lucky enough tonight to have a Roland SH-2 in the studio from 1979. But if you don't have a hardware synth, you can actually use a free analog synthesizer plugin. So Tyrell N6 just got updated this month, and it is a completely free, the link is in the description for this video, incredible sounding analog synth plugin from UHE. They make some of the best plugins out there, and it's completely free. And the great thing is that I noticed is that this modern synth, like I said, this is just came out this month, has basically the same layout as a synthesizer that's 46 years old. And so we're going to go through how to make sounds. I'm going to be using the old vintage analog hardware because I happen to have it. But we're going to go through oscillators, filters, all of that stuff, and make it super easy, because it can be really intimidating when you're getting into analog synthesis, trying to learn everything, but it doesn't need to be as complicated as everybody makes it. It's actually very simple. So if you're new to synthesis, I'd recommend pausing the video and downloading Tyrell N6 from the link in the description, completely free. And then you can follow along with us. And I'm going to be showing you guys how I do it on the hardware, but also on the software as I go. And so the really cool thing about analog synths are they're virtually all the same. There's quirks to all of the hardware and software out there. They all have different features and stuff, but basically they do a lot of the same things. So I'm going to start by sort of just initializing this a bit and getting it to sound more or less like this. I have a little bit of echo on there, which was nice for the intro, but we'll turn that off. That way it sounds like Tyrell N6 here. So first off, let's look at oscillators. And I want to say too, if you're new here, I'm going to put a chapters down below. That way you can click to whatever part's helpful for you. And this will probably be like a longer live stream, like 2 hours. But don't let that intimidate you, because you can just click to what you want to learn. And also I'm going to focus on the details in the beginning of the stream, all the stuff you need to know as quickly as possible, and then more answers to questions later on in the stream. Synthcat, Gingy, welcome. So let's start with the oscillator section. So if you have Tyrell N6, it looks like that. And what's amazing is the waveform selection is basically the same. We've got sine wave, which is that wave on the bottom left here. And the reason it's called a sine wave is because that's the shape. And it has this very smooth sound to it. And then I've got what's the tune knob here on the N6 is the range knob on this piece of hardware. And you can see it has that really smooth shape to it on the oscilloscope above the synthesizer. And that's just changing the octave, right? So whether you want it to be a higher pitch sound or not, but it's the same note. I'm going to assume you guys know what an octave is. So it's all F. I'm playing an F note right here. And that's all a synth does, by the way. I should say, before we jump in too deep with oscillators, this is the only part of a synthesizer, or the primary part of a synthesizer, that makes sound, actually, that generates noise on its own. And so what is an oscillator? It's actually really, when you think about it, kind of like a Game Boy or a Nintendo Entertainment System. I think you guys know what those are, even if you're Gen Z. They're just very basic buzzing, and the shape just determines the sound. So each shape has a different sound to our ears. So sine is the smoothest. If I move the waveform knob 1 over, it's going to be a sawtooth wave. Now that's the one in the upper right-hand corner there on the oscillator shape. And you'll see on the oscilloscope, which is just a way to visualize the sounds we're hearing, that instead of being smooth, it's more like a sawtooth wave, like a ramp. It's a little loud. I'm going to turn that down a bit. There we go. And so whatever key I play, that's actually just cutting up the voltage. And we get that nice sawtooth sound. Now, the sawtooth has got to be the most used. Portal Compacts, welcome. The most used sound in all of synthesis. And that's because it's the fullest. It's got the most harmonics in it. And it's just got this bright, buzzy character. It sounds really good low. And it also sounds really good high. Really great sound. And I should say here too, real quick, before we get too deep into how to make your own sounds, what even makes a synth analog? And the answer is, in one way of thinking of it, is it's not digital. So what is digital? Digital is where something's done in a computer. I'm oversimplifying this pretty aggressively, but just to make it super simple for you guys, there's nothing computerized in this synthesizer. There's no processor or anything. This synth is entirely analog from 1979. And so all that's really happening is voltage is being converted into sound. And that's why this oscillator is actually labeled VCO1. That stands for voltage controlled oscillator. Voltage controlled oscillator, meaning that the oscillator is just controlled by the voltage of the electricity. And the keyboard is just actually controlling how much voltage gets fed to that oscillator, and then it's shaped into a sound. So it's very simple. So that's our sawtooth wave. Most common, if you're ever in doubt, go to the sawtooth wave first. When I think of sawtooth waves, I think it's great for brass sounds. I think it's great for string sounds. I think it's great for bright bass lines or guitar sounds, all sorts of things like that. Now, moving on to the next waveform, we have square waves, right? Most synthesizers only have 2 or 3 waves. You'll notice that Tyrell N6 has 4, but in this case, we've only got basically 3. So this is because we don't have a triangle wave. And a triangle wave sounds just like a square wave, but a little darker. So it's an easy emission, and we do have a sine wave, which sounds kind of like a triangle wave as well. So here's a square wave. And you'll notice, especially if I play up higher, there you can see on the oscilloscope that it's pretty square. The reason it's not perfectly square is this analog synth isn't perfect. And that's one of the things we love about analog synths is the imperfections. And Tyrell N6 does emulate this. So the square waves in Tyrell N6 are not perfect digital waves, but they are like an analog synth where the wave isn't perfect. But it looks kind of like a square wave. If I change it back to a sawtooth, you'll see a big difference. So what's a square wave good for? Well, I always think square waves are great for woodwind type sounds. A square wave could also be a great bell, right? Because it's kind of got that more hollow characteristic to it. You'll notice that as we get lower, the wave starts to get a little bent. And that's, again, just because it's a real synth. So it's not going to be perfect all the way through. So let's see. Rob Swords and Synthesizer says digital, think zeros and ones, and analog, think variable and continuous waves, resistors, capacitor, op amps, that type of a thing. Jim says he uses saw more than anything. That's 99% of people use a lot of sawtooth waves. And then we move on to pulse width modulation. So this is the only wave that's going to be a little more complicated than just we press a key and we get a wave. So what is pulse width modulation? Well, if you imagine this square wave again, we can actually visualize it very clearly on the screen here. So as I move the pulse width mod up, it's going to narrow the wave, and it's easier to understand if you just see it. And so if I play this narrow wave, these are often called pulse waves. It's a very thin type of a sound. Kind of nasal. And when it's that thin, it's a very nasal. It can be good for certain sorts of reed instruments, like saxophones kind of have that nasally, harmonicas, clavichord. In the middle range, they can actually be good for like acoustic guitars, electric guitars, pianos. It's a little thinner than a square wave because a full square wave has a lot of weight to it. Can actually be a really good bass line sound. Right? But as you narrow it out, and again, this should sound reminiscent to some of you guys, even if you've never experienced an analog synth before, because it kind of sounds like a Game Boy. And in essence, that's what a Game Boy is. It's an analog synth. It's just using square waves. They don't even have a sawtooth wave, just square waves and different pulse widths. All the sounds you get out of a Game Boy. And then an important sound that's not mentioned, that we haven't mentioned yet, I only have access to on VCO2. On Tyrell N6, we actually have to go to the mixer here. We have a separate noise section here. On this synthesizer, because analog parts are expensive, you have to give up the sound of the second oscillator to get noise. But this is what it sounds like. That's noise. And the thing about noise is it doesn't have a pitch. So when I press any key, it's the same. That's the nature of what noise is. So noise is great for adding breath to a sound, because that's when you think about breath, like, it's not so different than, right? Wind, it sounds like snow. It sounds like the breath on a woodwind, the noise you get through a pipe. Could be used for all sorts of things. Can be used to make drum sounds, right? You could turn that into like a hi-hat on a drum kit. So anyways, those are the different sounds. Now, when it comes to pulse width modulation, we can actually tell the synthesizer to move the pulse width for me. Now, on this synthesizer, the way I do that, I've got a little switch that moves between the LFO. We'll explain what that is later on. Manual and envelope. It's on manual, so right now when I move this, going back here, it's manually adjusting the width of the pulse wave, right? But if I put it to LFO, now it's going to automatically move that for me by the amount of this fader. And that's a certain kind of sound that many, many analog synths do. And it's kind of unique to square waves, because when you look at a sawtooth wave, for instance, there's no part of that wave that's all the way down or all the way up, right? It's kind of a ramp. So most of the time, you can't modulate the width of a sawtooth wave, but on a square wave, you can. Hey, Miss FD, how's it going? I'm wearing my Miss FD Curse Breaker shirt. If you haven't checked out her new single yet, you definitely should. So that's a certain kind of sound pulse width modulation that you're going to hear time and time again. And that's basically what we've just covered, more or less explains everything you need to know about the core of how synthesis starts. So all analog synths basically work this way. You've just got a couple of different waveforms, and that's how you make a sound. And you might be thinking to yourself, that doesn't sound like all the synth sounds I've ever heard. And that's because, yeah, there is more that goes into it, but if you can get your head around that, I don't think it's that complicated. So real quick, we'll just cover it one more time before we move forward, because this is important. We've got sine waves. very pure sound. Can be used for a flute as well. And just very pure because of the way that that wave shape is so smooth. Then we got sawtooth wave, everybody's favorite. And again, you can see little imperfections in the oscilloscope, and that's just because this is a real synthesizer. So a digital synth can make a pretty perfect sawtooth, which has a certain kind of sound. But the reason we like analog synths is because they're not perfect. Now, we have more than one oscillator on most analog synths. Why is that? The reason is because a single violin on its own sounds good, but you get a few violins together in an orchestra and it sounds incredible. Now, psychoacoustically, we really only need one more oscillator to sort of give us this sound of lushness that we were missing when you only have one oscillator. That sounds good. Now, if I bring in another oscillator, and I need to make sure that they are the same range there. Look at how the oscilloscope is dancing now. And if I'm playing lower than that, the tuning is very tight actually. So the tighter the tuning is, so I've got a little tune knob here. You'll notice that that's called fine tune down below on Tyrell N6 if you're following along with the plugin. But if I get the tuning very tight, and on an analog synth like this, it's almost never perfect because the voltage drift is in there. On a digital synth, you can get the tuning perfect, and it has a very kind of unnatural sound, right? So you almost always want to have a little bit of tuning imperfections if you're going to have more than one oscillator at a time. But you can see how it's dancing, right? So what are we hearing? And what I would call that is phasing or beating. And the reason it's beating is because if I take it further out of tune, you'll see it's faster. So it actually creates a beat, right? That's why it's called beating. But phasing is another phrase. It's just a word to say that these two waves are interfering with each other, and it creates a very beautiful sound. Down low, it sounds so good too. That's very close tune. But they're still moving slightly. Yeah. DeKarmic asks, phasing or beating is essentially how chorus works, right? And I want to encourage you guys, if you have any questions at all, this is the perfect stream to ask them. This is any question, no matter if you think it's a little silly. Not saying your question's silly. It's actually a very good question. DeKarmic, yes and no. It is a different sound than what chorus does. What a chorus does is, I could get into it. Let me just say it's different, but it does create phasing and beating as well in its own way, but it is a different sound because it doesn't combine a separate oscillator. It combines actually a copy of the sound. So it does sound a little different. And you'll see that it's already drifting a little bit more because the analog voltage in this synth is never perfect. So these oscillators have a little bit of life and movement into them, which is why people love analog synths so much. But there's nothing wrong with an oscillator that's pretty in tune. That's a good thing. So if I take it a little out of tune, it sounds really good. lot of retro sounds have this sort of tight but a little bit out of tune sound. And again, we're just listening to 2 sawtooth waves, right? All I did there was just change the tune knob, which would be down here on Tyrell N6, that knob right there. Just because I only have this many keys, so I have to tune them up and down tonight. How's it going, Analog Rich? Welcome. And I can take it even further. Now, if I take it that far out, it sounds genuinely out of tune, or like... Somewhere around there is where I would say is kind of like the maximum amount before it gets what I call seasick, or a little like not pleasant to the ear. A lot of the harder, darker music uses more detuned oscillators to give that sense of pathos, or, you know, a little bit of pain, emotion to it. It can also just sound really lush and beautiful. If I turn the delay back on, it actually sounds very nice, doesn't it? Even though it is a little on the edge of out of tune. That's one of those things that when I first got into synths, I was a little intimidated to take the second oscillator out of tune a bit, because I'm like, I don't want the synth to be out of tune. But it's only taking it enough out of tune to give it that nice chorusing, that phasing, that beating, that emulates the sound of multiple violins or whatever, what have you, playing together, barbershop, quartet. You know, it's multiple voices singing together is what we're basically going for. Now, of course, we can combine different waveforms, right? Now, I want to go back also real quick. Jump back to VCO1 and put it on pulse width mod. And I want you to notice that if I put it on square waves, and I have 2 square waves at once, versus 1 square wave on pulse width modulation, it's kind of doing a similar thing, right? You can see how it's dancing. Or if I put 2 square waves on, right? Do you see that? Do you see how it's actually turning into a narrow pulse there? So it ends up sounding different than pulse width modulation on its own. You can see the way the synth is doing it is not exactly the same, but it's almost emulating the sound of 2 oscillators together. So let's break down why that is. So when you take 2 perfect waves and you play them at the exact same time, if one was going up at the time the other one's going down, right? Because the square wave has an up part of it and a down part. It would actually cancel out perfectly. We're speaking scientifically, digitally, perfect, possible, hypothetically, theoretically here. It would cancel out perfectly. And that's because it's sort of like a wave in the ocean. If you were able to control waves, this is probably a terrible analogy, but if you're able to control waves with your mind, let's say, and a wave was going up, and then the voltage in your mind was telling the wave to go down the exact same amount, right? It would just not go anywhere, right? Terrible, terrible analogy, but it's the one that came to mind. So if another way to think of it is if the voltage telling the wave to go up is the same as the wave to go down, right? Then it would perfectly cancel out. And that's actually how it works with a synthesizer, because everything's getting combined together before it goes out to your speakers. In this case, this synth is going into my computer, then going through the internet to your computer where your computer is reproducing the sound. But it all kind of gets summed down to just one wave, right? So again, if a square wave is going up while the other one's going down, it cancels out. Now, because this synth isn't perfect, right, we're not going to get that. Now, I could try to get close with some tuning. See, at that moment, you can see it flip there. There's like a microsecond, a micromillisecond where it is non-present. We gotta wait a bit. So that's full square wave. We gotta wait a bit more. And it's about to hit that point. It almost does it on this synth, but because it's not perfect. So that's actually kind of what pulse width modulation simulates, is the sound of two oscillators. So there's actually some analog synths that only have one oscillator, but they use pulse width modulation to simulate the sound of more than one oscillator. A lot of famous synths, like the Juno 106, the most traded vintage analog synthesizer on Reverb, only has that one oscillator, but it can do pulse width modulation to give you a fatter, more lush sound. So that's how that works. Now, what are some recipes we could use? So let's talk about flutes for a second. If we want to do a flute, we could do a sine wave and noise, right? Because a flute has both noise and that tonal component. And we don't need much noise. You can see how that noise just sort of adds some fuzz into the waveform there. Bill, welcome. Everybody having a good time so far? By the way, can I get some scum cheers in the chat? If you're new to the channel here, please like and subscribe. I do a lot of really deep synthesizer content, but I thought it was important to do one every once in a while. It's been about a year since I've done a video that's a little bit more introductory or beginner friendly to get into the wonderful world of synthesizers. So if you're new here, I want to say a cheers to you for taking the plunge and taking the brave step off the plank into the world of synthesizers. You won't regret it. Welcome. Cheers, guys. Walter, how's it going, my friend? So that's one way we could do that. If we wanted to do strings, like I was saying, we could do two sawtooth waves. And then just detune them a bit. Especially up high. We start getting kind of those violin-y type tones, right? We haven't done anything else. We could combine different waveforms, right? So we could do the square wave up high. So this is a square wave on oscillator 2 and a sawtooth wave on oscillator 1. That's shape 1 and 2 down below here on Tyrell N6 if you're following along with the plugin. And so you can see on the oscilloscope over here, all sorts of different interesting shapes we're getting by combining two shapes together. Because again, everything gets summed down to one shape, right? This whole synthesizer, everything we're going to do is just going to create one wave shape. What we could even do is use pulse width modulation on one oscillator and the sawtooth on the other. We could set them to different ranges. So this is in the middle here. I could bring this down lower. And look at that complexity we're building up just from two oscillators. That's it. So really beautiful analog sounds, and we haven't really messed with most of the synth. We've just been focusing on this oscillator section. So what is the last thing that we haven't mentioned yet? So if we go over to the mixer here, the mixer, you'll see we have a sub down below here. So right here, it's harder to point at this. right there is the sub fader, right? And on this synthesizer, I've got VCO1, VCO2, and the sub oscillator. So basically OSC1, OSC2, and the sub oscillator. Again, I'm just shocked at how this current plugin has almost an identical thing. Now you'll notice noise is on the plugin its own separate thing. So we don't have to give up an oscillator to get noise. And then you've got ring modulator, feedback. Don't worry about that. That's more complex than we need to worry about. So what is a sub oscillator? So a sub oscillator is another oscillator. So in both of these synths, we have 3 oscillators in total. But what makes a sub unique and not its own oscillator, a true oscillator in its own right, is it's derived from one of the oscillators. So on my synth, it actually is labeled VCO1 sub, meaning whatever we do with VCO1 creates the sub oscillator. And a sub oscillator is just an octave down. So in the same way that my VCOs currently are 1 octave apart, if they were the same octave, they'd sound like this. We could get them very tight in tuning. If I turn this down 1 click, that gives us 1 octave down. And then this sub oscillator is an octave down even from that. And on this synth, it's always an octave down from the first VCO. And what's happening here is it's actually another square wave. It doesn't matter what wave I'm using. It doesn't matter if I'm using a sine wave, pulse width modulation, or anything. It's going to be the same wave. And so, in fact, on this synth and on N6, we can turn off our oscillators and listen to just the sub oscillator. And you'll see it's the exact same as the square wave, right? So we're just listening to the sub oscillator now. And if I turn the oscillator on and put it down an octave on square wave, it's exactly the same. So sub oscillators, for technical reasons, are almost always square waves. There she is. Now, let's bring that in, and we've got 3 octaves now of square waves. So that is a way to make a synth even fatter sounding. And there was sort of almost like an arms race going on in analog synths in the 70s and 80s, like who could put more oscillators into a synth. This was the first Roland synth that you could carry around with you that had 3 oscillators, the 2 voltage controlled oscillators and a sub oscillator. So that's what makes this synthesizer, again, 46 years ago, this was brand new technology. No one had seen a synth like this. There was the Mini Moog, which had 3 oscillators, but it didn't have a sub oscillator like this does. And it is a powerful sound. If you want to do an electro bass type sound, it's so good, right? And it's just deep. But again, like I said, we could change this to, say, sawtooth waves on the oscillators. It's still a square wave down below. And there is this really cool way in which a sub oscillator, because it's created from the first oscillator, if I change the pitch, it follows the pitch of the first oscillator. It's always following that, which is super great. So I think that's basically everything you'll ever need to know about oscillators, to be honest with you. There's a couple of other things, and other synths have different tricks and things, cross mod, hard sync. But for most people, most of the time, that's everything you need to know. That's the very simple basics here, and we're not even that deep into the stream. So if you've followed this far, cheers to you. I appreciate you. This synth sounds so great. So now, that's the mixer section. We've covered that. Let's get to the fun part, the filter. So, what is a filter? At its core, a filter, most of the time, it can be used a couple of different ways, but I would say 95% of the time, if you just bought an analog synth from Sweetwater or Amazon today, the filter is going to cut out the high end as you go. So, what does that mean? If I go back to my oscillator sound here, and I bring the cutoff, which on the plugin is this first fader right here, this guy. I've got cutoff and resonance as well. There's some other shit on Tyrell N6 that's more complicated, but we don't really need to worry about that. We do have keyboard follow on both of these synths though, which is interesting. It actually kind of follows the same. You've got mod 1 and mod 2. It's the exact same thing on this synth. You can change the filter modes and things like that on Tyrell N6 because it is more advanced. In 46 years, thank God there's been some advancement. But it's basically identical to what a vintage analog synth could do. And it can emulate it really well. So if I bring the cutoff down, let's listen to what this does to the sound. Wow. Isn't that interesting? Look at how it's turned all of those three oscillators with sawtooth and square waves into a sine wave. Right? Don't you remember that from earlier in the stream? It's just turned it into a sine wave. So what's happening there? Very good sine wave, actually. You can see it's not exactly perfect, so it's got some character to it. Different than not. So what's happening there? Well, if I open the cutoff all the way, there's an obvious thing happening that I don't even have to tell you, which is it's a brighter, more full across the entire frequency spectrum sound. From high, buzzy characteristics through the mids is what we call like the meat of the sound that is more or less the part of your ear is most sensitive to. And then the lows are those wonderful subwoofer shaking, you know, just club rattling sounds. With the filter all the way open, we have all of those frequencies. With the filter halfway closed, we have the lows and we have some of the mids, but not much of the highs. And if I bring it all the way down, we have almost nothing. If I bring a little bit in, we've got just the lows. So the way sound works is there's a fundamental, and we're going to get only you need two words here, and that's it. That's as technical as this gets. It's a beautiful thing. You've got a fundamental, and all the fundamental is the root sine wave of a sound. And then you've got harmonics. And what are those? Those are the bits of sound above the fundamental that give our ears the character of the sound. That's the brightness, right? So a sine wave has no harmonics. It's just the fundamental. That's a sine wave. Right? Very just that sound that we heard earlier in the stream. And we have that as a waveform source here on the synthesizer and on oscillator shapes on Tyrell N6. The one on the lower left there, that's a sine wave, right? So that is the purest form of sound. And then as you add harmonics, that's where you get these interesting variations with the oscilloscope there. So if I bring it up a bit, you can see this interesting effect, which is the waveform is less spiky than it is with the filter all the way open. with it all the way open, you can really see those sawtooth spikes. And you can hear the buzziness, the brightness, the character up high, right? All of those frequencies all the way up to the range of human hearing. If I bring the filter down, the sound gets darker. That's what a filter does. It makes the sound darker. I love what Dubstation Zero just said. My favorite synth analogy for beginners is your voice. Vocal cords, the things in your throat, that's the oscillator. So if my mouth is all the way open, right, you hear the fullness of the vocal cords. If I close my mouth down, you lose the high end and it becomes ow, moi. And breath loudness is VCA and envelope. We'll get into all of that. But just like your mouth, if I close my mouth, right? And if I open my mouth, right? You get a brighter sound. So that's exactly what a filter is. It's sort of the mouth of your synthesizer. And right now, if you can get your head around that, you're good to go. Everything else sort of follows from, we've got oscillators and we have a filter that controls the tone. So that's what tone means, right? If you've ever heard someone say, oh, that's got a really good tone, that guitar has a good tone, or I like the sound of that synthesizer. They're really talking about how much brightness, everything that's going in there. So what are some examples of this, right? So the first thing is, if I want to make a bass sound, right, a deep bass sound, I don't need a lot of brightness a lot of the time. Because what happens is, if you take out some of that high end, but you boost the volume, we get sort of a bassline type sound out of it. Right? That's a recipe. And again, it doesn't really matter what we're doing with the oscillators too much right now, because we're just focusing on what kinds of sounds we get out of the filter. So if I open up the filter a bit more, turn the volume down, we're starting to get more mid-rangey type sounds. This is really great for like pads. So pad is a type of synth sound like strings, certain brass sounds, right? They don't have all of the frequencies in there, but they have some warmth to them, but they're not as dark or as dull or as bassy sounding as a bass sound. So they have, the cutoff is giving you some of the mid-range, somewhere around there. This is kind of that territory where you've got the mid-range, but you don't really have the high end in there. So if you wanted to just add a little of that vibe in there, that's how you do it with that mid-range. And then if we open the cutoff frequency all the way, this is great for leads. Because on a lead sound, you kind of want to have all of that bright grit attack there. You know, you think about like Jimi Hendrix's guitar at Woodstock 69, right? It is a very bright, distorted sound. So to get that sort of cutting through the mix sort of a thing, you probably want to have the oscillators up a bit and a very open filter. So those are sort of your recipes of the different frequency ranges that you might want to use the filter for. We got a couple more things to talk about with the filter. The next knob over on Tyrell N6 here, resonance, right? So it's labeled the same way on this synthesizer that's almost half a century old. Again, I can't get over the fact that essentially analog synths haven't changed at all. What resonance does is it just adds a little peak right where the cutoff frequency is. So if I hold down this note and I add some resonance here, I need to turn that off actually. Let me do a little, what we call a filter sweep in the community. So if I hold this note down and I open and close the filter and kind of a wow type noise. If I add some resonance to that now, you'll notice it's more of a pronounced sound. If I add some more, you'll really hear it. If I add some even more, we'll start to get to where you really, the resonance itself starts to scream. Again, no resonance, with resonance. See how it's starting to scream on an old analog synth like this? You can actually push it really hard, a lot harder than on some modern synths. Where the filter itself is actually creating, when you've cranked the resonance far enough, it's actually creating a new sine wave at that frequency. So it's pushing that harmonic forward. No resonance, with resonance. No resonance, with resonance. So yeah, like Jim's saying, it's whistling at that frequency. It's emphasizing, and the original Mini Moog said emphasis, I believe, not resonance. It's emphasizing that frequency, whatever the cutoff is at. So that's the highest frequency that's being let through the filter, right? Do I have anybody here who's a beginner who's not following so far? I would love to know if I've skipped over anything, if there's anything that's confusing about what I've said. Hopefully I've laid everything out pretty simply. Now, a feature, if you look at key follow here on Tyrell N6 or keyboard right here, it's the same thing. What this does, if I turn all the way up, now what's happening is as I play higher up on the keys, it adjusts the cutoff frequency so that with high resonance, we can actually sort of get cool sounds. So it's now following the key bed so that the resonance moves with the notes. Now, if I turn keyboard follow off, and I find that same frequency, right? It works on this note, but when I play a different note, it's out of tune, right? So it's actually a very useful thing for certain, whoa, my microphone went flying there. Certain types of sounds, it's very cool to use keyboard tracking. See how it's got a consistent tone across the keyboard now? So that's how you can get a very different sound. And so we're now kind of making sound. And if you noticed earlier in the stream, I actually corrected myself. I said oscillators are the only, and then I corrected myself to primary way that you make sound with an analog synth. So the filter is the only other way. The secondary way we can actually create sound with an analog synth is by emphasizing certain frequencies. So without a filter, we wouldn't be able to get these really piercing, nasally type sounds. Squishmallow fan, I'm really happy that you're enjoying this. And again, if anybody has any questions, I know a lot of the people who watch this live stream every week, which is a thing we do, by the way. Every single Wednesday, we do a live stream here covering something to do with synthesizers. A lot of you guys know more about synths than I do. So this might be a stream that's a little bit simple for some of the people who follow along. But I think it's important that at least once a year, we open our arms and welcome in all the new people to the synthesizer community. And hopefully this live stream will be everything you need to know. So if there's anybody here, don't feel embarrassed to ask any questions, okay? I love questions. Daddy loves questions. So anyways, that's how we get these sounds. If I take this really low, we can basically turn any sound back into a sine wave. And you can see that in the oscilloscope over here. But it's not exactly the same thing as if we open up the oscillator and just played a sine wave, right? It's a little different. And that's the beautiful thing about analog synths, is that everything you do, again, I showed you how pulse width modulation is kind of similar to two detuned oscillators, but it's not exactly the same. It's kind of like that here. You can get close to the sound of a sine wave. That's very close to this sound. But it's not exactly the same. So it's just kind of a fun point. It's very, it's kind of thicker, actually. I kind of like doing it this way. Aquatic says he's layering Tyrell with my Argon 8, which is a really cool virtual analog hardware synthesizer. It's a good contrast. Argon has 8 MSEGs. What's an MSEG? I actually don't know. Jonathan Huber asked, do you have any favorite oscillator shape combinations? I do. So the all-time fave, I'm going to open the cutoff frequency back up. I'll just use 2 for now, right? So jumping back to oscillator shapes here. I love 2 sawtooths beating against each other. It's just the most beautiful sound. It's the classic synthesizer sound. I also like actually a sawtooth wave and either a sine or a triangle wave, because those are really deep. If I want to do some sort of bass sound, right? And the tuning, it gets really interesting here. Isn't that a really cool, kind of different bass line type sound? And I see this kind of question about high resonance and volume there. So we'll talk about that in a split second. So I'm making a mental note. I also just love the sound of sawtooth waves. So for leads, a sawtooth wave or like a bell can be made from a square wave 2 octaves apart, but with tighter tuning here. So, or even more, like 3 octaves apart. You can hear how that's starting to get that sort of bell-like tone. So there's a few different ways we could get there. Now, jumping back to resonance here for a second. As I increase resonance, we do sort of lose volume. Now, depending on the synthesizer you have, you may lose more or less. And Swords and Synthesizers, Rob says, high resonance seems to kill loudness because the power under the curve of each wave is halved. Now, I don't really even want to pretend that, like, I know what that means, although I believe he's probably right. The way I would describe it is that as this resonance frequency is being pushed forward, the sound of the oscillators is coming back. Now, some synthesizers compensate for that a little bit more by actually, and this is literally what they do, cranking the oscillators even louder into the filter to sort of stop that effect. But especially a lot of old synthesizers followed the sound of the Mini Moog, and the Mini Moog was like that, where you lose both level and actually bass. So as you crank the resonance, even if I'm playing like a nice, let's go back to that bass sound I was doing with a sine wave and a sawtooth wave, right? You hear a little bit of noise getting in there. That's the beautiful thing about old circuits. If I crank the resonance, we'll lose a lot of that low end. Even before it's singing, it's almost like pulse width modulation again, in that sense where we've lost the fullness of the sound. If I bring the resonance out though, you can see that peak kind of open up. You got that big bassy peak, and then if I bring it in, it just pulls that peak right there down. And then as I crank the resonance further, we start introducing that new frequency in there, right? And down there, it's like a big, bad, beefy sine wave type sound. So that's the interesting thing about resonance on a synthesizer. Depending on the synth, it's also going to change the tone of the sound of the synth, not just emphasizing that frequency. Now on Tyrell N6, I'm pretty sure when you crank the resonance, you end up with just more of that peak frequency, and you might not lose quite as much bass as you do here. This is a vintage synth, so the way they did it back then is a little different. That's one of those things. I actually like synths that don't do that. I like synths that have a lot of bass as you crank them. But there is something fun about having one of these vintage synths. So, what do we have left? We actually only have, in a vintage synthesizer, 3 things. We have the oscillator, the filter, and we have the envelope. Or I'm sorry, not even the envelope. I misspoke there. Wipe that from your brain. We have the amplifier, the oscillator, the filter, and the amplifier. What is the amplifier? It is the volume. And I've saved it for last because it's actually the simplest. Now it's off. Now it's on. My volume knob is a little scratchy, so why don't I do it over here? Off. I'm just controlling the volume. That's all I'm doing, is just turning the volume up and down. That's the amplifier. That's all an amplifier does, is the volume of a synthesizer. So, why do we even need an amplifier other than just turning it up and down, right? Well, the reason is we might want to vary that over time. So everything we've been doing so far pretty much has been manual, except for the pulse width mod, little thing that we were letting the synthesizer do for us automatically, right? But other than that, everything we've done, we've been making these oscillators have a certain sound by twisting the knobs, and we have the filter cut off resonance. You'll notice that as I play something more in tune, the oscilloscope is more stable. Very stable sort of wave I've created there. As I pull this, the resonant peak is actually out of tune with the oscillator. It gets more chaotic. Right? So that's another sort of visual indication of what we're hearing, right? And so what's so cool about an analog synth is that if you understand oscillators, which I've now told you virtually everything you'll ever need to know in your life about oscillators, filters, if you understand what a filter does, it makes the sound duller, and you can add some resonance, and that kind of emphasizes the peak of that filter. That's the only kind of a little bit counterintuitive part. And then you understand a volume knob. That's it. Everything else is how we tell the synthesizer to move those knobs for us. And that's the part where I think people, their minds just go, but when you really think about it, a synthesizer only moves a knob in one of two ways. It either does it in a sort of cyclical motion, like follows. Bill, which actual term? Sorry, I might have ran through some of them. So it either moves things in a cyclical nature like that, meaning in a repetitive way, or it moves it once, sort of like going like that. See how that kind of is like a pluck, like almost the sound of a guitar string or something? If I go like that, you sort of have a sort of that sort of bow, bow. So if we want a cyclical, cycle-based type sound, we're going to use what's called an LFO, right? So we've got an LFO over here on Tyrell N6. It's called modulator on the SH-2, but it's the exact same thing. It's got a rate and a delay, and of course you'll see it's rate and delay here. And it's got a shape on Tyrell N6. It's a triangle wave to default. On this synth, it's a sine wave, but it's, if you think about a sine wave and a triangle wave are almost the same sort of shape. Yes, and so with Rob brings up low pass, high pass, notch, band pass filters. There are different types of filters, but 95% of the time, it's what we call a low pass filter. I should explain that. So I think low pass filters are named badly, but you're going to hear it time and time again if you're in the world of synthesizers. So what does a low pass filter do? It passes the low frequencies. So again, when I was saying that it cuts out the high end, it's letting through the low end or passing the low end. I think we should have called it the other way. It's much more intuitive to think of a filter as a high cut filter, because that's what it actively does. It cuts out the high end as you lower the cutoff frequency. It's cut out the high end. For whatever reason, we say it the opposite way. We say low pass filter. And that's a counterintuitive thing that I think was a major fuck up when we first started coining all of the phrases of synthesizers. It should have been the other way around because it's more intuitive. Now, there are other types of filters. So instead of a low pass filter, you could use a high pass, which is a low cut filter, because again, it's named kind of backwards. So a low cut filter. A band pass filter lets a narrow band of frequencies through, but not the lowest and not the highest. Don't worry about all that. In Tyrell N6, if you go to the filter over here, you can see we have VCF mode down there at the bottom. And VCF mode allows you to change the filter to those different types. So if you're following along right now, I would just pause the video and try out a few different types and see how they sound. And moving the cutoff, what happens, right? And you'll probably figure out pretty quick. Low pass filter is going to make the sound darker. High pass filter is going to let all of those sizzly frequencies through no matter what, but cut out the low end. It's actually pretty intuitive once you understand that. Notch filter just cuts out, again, like the middle frequencies, but not the high or the low. But 95% of analog synths are going to just have one filter, a low pass filter on it. So we can control the filter and the amplifier one of two or both at the same time ways, which is with an LFO for a cyclical kind of movement and with an envelope for a kind of a one-shot sort of movement. So why don't we just try those both out real quick? So the modulator is the LFO over here on Tyrell N6. Now, if we go to the filter here, you'll see LFO 1 has its own mod amount. So this knob is equivalent to this fader here. So I'm going to pick a frequency, turn that up a little bit. I've added a good amount of resonance so you can hear what's going on. And I'm going to just increase the mod amount, which is the mod 2 on Tyrell N6. And you can see how it's moving it up and down automatically for me. It's the same thing as if I move it up and down. It's hard for me to do it as perfectly as this analog synth can do it, though. Classic Crystal Vision, welcome. That's really awesome to hear, and welcome to this live stream. I don't think I've seen you here before, so if I have, I'm sorry, but welcome. Okay, so what's happening? Let's go over to the LFO section of Tyrell N6. Now, we have phase, rate mod, depth mod. Forget about all of that. That's not something you need to worry about with a basic analog synthesizer. Those are some additional features Tyrell N6 has had added because in 46 years' time, we've come up with a few more uses of things. But on my synth, I've only got 3 controls. I've got the shape, which on this is right here. It says triangle. Mine's set to sine wave, but it's going to sound about the same. Rate and delay. So what does rate do? If I change the rate, it changes the speed of that automatic movement. By the way, if you're into dubstep, this is how you get these sorts of dubsteppy type sounds. Is by using a filter, right, to create these wub type sounds with some resonance. If I bring the cutoff down a bit, we get this really vowely. And if you think about it, going back to what Dub Station 0 was saying, it really is like a mouth. So, whoa, 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 right? And it's being controlled by the LFO labeled modulator on this synth, but it's the exact same thing. So the rate controls the speed of that. And we can go a lot faster than I could physically move the knob, which is one of the cool things about synths. I've got a little LED here too, by the way, that's flashing how fast it's going. Just for a little visual feedback. At some point, you stop losing the ability to really understand what you're hearing, right? And we could go really slow, and what you'll see on the waveform there is being able to see how it's picking out those different frequencies. As I crank the resonance, you get these it really starts to push those frequencies forward. If I do it with less resonance, that's how you get more of those dubsteppy wub type sounds. Well, Bill, I hope this inspires you to get back to the synthesizers. So, what's delay time do? Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to delay in a second, because we can send the LFO not just to the filter. We could send it to the amplifier on some synths. Yeah, I think we can on this synth. We'll see in a second. Not all synths. Most, if not all, synthesizers will allow you to send the LFO to the filter and the oscillator. Some synths will let you send it to the amplifier as well, but not all of them. And So let's just talk about different shapes. So right now it's moving the cutoff frequency in a very normal movement, sort of like I would with my finger, right? Up and down. Triangle or sine wave will do that. If I put it to square, it's going to jump from the highest value to the lowest value. So you can see, in the same way that a square wave has an up part and a down part, now it's applying that same type of shape to the filter. And this will actually explain why we call it an LFO. Delay slows the rate of Alex drinking beer is awesome. So again, it's moving up and down, just like if we turn all that off for a second, we just go back to a square wave real quick. And you can see how there's an up and down on the square wave over there. The LFO is doing the same thing. Visually, you can kind of get it. It's going up, down, up, down. And that's because the LFO actually stands for low frequency oscillator. Now, this is one of those confusing things. At least in this case, when it comes to synthesizer terminology, this is accurate. Because what the LFO actually is just another oscillator, but it's tuned low enough that we can use it to do things automatically for us. So if you can hear an oscillator, that is, when I have this one oscillator, right, at this note, and we can hear it, right, it is essentially what's happening here is that is happening so many times a second that it becomes a pitch that we can hear. Now, if we use the sub oscillator, which is an octave down from there, this is the lowest octave I can go. And then I bend it even lower with the pitch bend here. You start to hear how it actually starts to sound like the LFO did at its fastest rate. Do you hear how it's like clicking now? It's just going. That's because if it goes below the rate of human hearing, it's actually slow enough that it's like individual events as opposed to a wave, right? You can hear it just fall apart. And so what we're technically doing is taking an oscillator that we can't hear. It's never routed into the filter, and the amplifier will never hear the LFO, right? But we're using it as a control source. Again, a voltage source to control the filters. Everybody follow that? That's like we're getting into one of those things that's a little counterintuitive because we're not used to thinking of the difference between individual events and sound as being the same thing. Like if I'm hitting the desk here, right, or the synth, I don't think you can hear that, right? That sounds like 4 individual things. But if we were to do that fast enough, if I could do that as fast as this oscillator goes in the synthesizer, you would hear it as a tone, as a pitch. So that's the idea of using actually a low frequency oscillator to control something like the VCF, right? So back to our sound. Again, if I crank the rate up all the way up, it sort of sounds almost like the sub oscillator as far down as I can take it. This is my personal synth. Yes, I own this synthesizer. very lucky to have this synth in the studio. It's a very cool piece of gear that's almost half a century old, and it's amazing that it still works as well as it does. Now, what if we didn't want to route that? So I'm going to turn that fader down on Tyrell N6. That would just by bringing the mod source down here, right? What if I wanted to use that on the oscillator, right? Well, I actually have that on this other section right by the modulator, and on here we go on Tyrell N6, it's called OscMod, and we've got vibrato and pulse width modulation. So in the same way that I have a pulse width mod slider here, that was what I was controlling earlier to control the amount of pulse width. You've got that on Tyrell N6 right over here, right there. And then vibrato. So it's labeled a little differently, but it's the same thing. We're going to take that same LFO and I'm going to put it back from square wave to the triangle wave. And then we're going to apply it to the oscillator. I'm going to turn it down just, I'm going to get just a clean sound with no detune because I've turned voltage control the oscillator to off. So we're just listening to the oscillator and the subs. So there's no detune, chorusing, phasing, beating, anything like that. So we can hear what the vibrato does, or on my synth, it's just the mod amount. You can see what it's doing is it's bending that pitch up and down. This is the same thing a violin player does when they're bowing. If you've ever seen them move their fingers like this while they're bowing, they're adding vibrato, which is the Italian fancy word for bending the pitch up and down. And it can sound very beautiful. It's a little extreme in this case, but a little amount. Twin Cities is saying it very well. If the LFO is basically an extra hand that turns something for you, right? That's all an LFO or an envelope does. We're going to get to that last. But an LFO is just, again, it's actually just adjusting the tuning knob for me automatically. And it does so in a cyclical way. And just like we had a square wave earlier, we can do that same wave shape with pitch. It's a little more unnatural on the oscillator pitch, but it can be fun for effects. The amount we use sets how far apart the highest and lowest value is. So all the way off, it's doing nothing, but as I increase it, so at around that point, it's an octave apart. So the highest note and the lowest note are an octave apart, and it doesn't sound that terrible. That's pretty much the only use I can think of for routing a square wave LFO to the pitch of the oscillators. It's kind of cool though, because it allows you to get this sort of octavey type sound. If you use it, slow it down, you can basically turn it into an automatic bass line. Paul and Insomnia Noir, welcome to the stream. So I wouldn't say that's the best way to get that sort of a sound. So again, we're using an LFO to do it for me automatically. If I turn the modulation off, it's basically this note. Right? I'm basically getting that effect, but by doing it with the LFO, I can kind of do it. You know, it's not very precise, and if you're trying to play that in time with a song or with a band, it's probably going to be out of time. So it's not the best way to do it, but you can do it that way. And so I at least wanted to show you that's probably the only example of using a square wave routed to the oscillators that I can think of. But maybe someone else out there knows. So going back to the sine wave or triangle wave, it really won't matter. In this case, you're going to hear it the same way. Let's hear how this sounds. So it's adding a wiggle to the pitch. Now, that on its own is a little rough, right? If I go up an octave and I add some delay, now all the delay is going to do is it's going to wait from when I hit the key to actually vibratoing, right? Or adding the vibrato. So again, if you think of a violin player, you'll see them bow the string, and then once they've been bowing it for a little bit, they start to add a little vibrato in. So that's what we're doing here by adding a delay time. And again, on the LFO here on Tyrell N6, we've got the delay knob right there, right? So that's the exact same thing. We've got different shapes. If you click here on Tyrell N6, you'll get that square wave. That's one of the options. And then you've got the delay, and it's the same thing. So how does that sound? That sounds like this. I'll emphasize it a bit. So that's how you can get like a really good sort of natural vibrato that doesn't come in immediately. So if I play a little lick, you could hear that the delay only kicks in when I've held a note long enough. That way it stops the sound from getting so boring. I'm going to decrease the delay time a bit. And I'm going to decrease the amount because it's a little dramatic right now. And I'll show you what it can sound like. So a little less mod, and I increase the rate a bit. That's beautiful. Very subtle amounts go a long way because without that, it just sounds static. And our ear will get bored of that because it just sounds like a fucking Game Boy, right? But if I increase a little bit, it helps break that up a little bit. And so that's the basis. And you do make a good point there. Jim says kind of removes the need for a pitch wheel. So most synths either have a wheel. This has this little thing that goes left to right. But on most synthesizers nowadays, you have a wheel that goes up and down that controls the pitch. And that just allows you to bring in a little of that yourself, a little vibrato. But you could do it automatically. And so LFOs are a great way to add vibrato to a sound. So that's the primary two uses for an LFO actually, is just modulate the oscillator or modulate the filter. So again, it's super simple. I think so far we haven't done anything too crazy, but yeah, we need some more alcohol. I need a little more mezcal here. How's everybody enjoying this so far? I know a lot of you guys, this is probably like the first going back to the beginning, but sometimes, first off, listening to the SH-2, it's just a gorgeous sounding synth. So it's kind of fun anyways. But then also, occasionally, even some of you synthesizer snobs out there might pick up a thing or two, or haven't thought about in a while. So, moving on to envelopes. So this is where it gets good. I know it's a lot. If you're a beginner and you've gotten this far in the stream, I know it's a lot, but stick with me. Come back and watch the video again, maybe get to this point, and then, okay, digest, play around with Tyrell for a bit, and then pick up from this point, right? An envelope is going to move this fader So in this case, I'm going to just turn off the LFO. So we're back to just our sawtooth and sub oscillator. Let's bring the filter back down to where we have a sine wave. We have a little sine wave here, right? Now we want to open and close the filter, but let's do it just once, right? So what we need to do that is for us to use this envelope. So we've got attack, decay, sustain, release. ADSR. I don't know if you can read that. ADSR, right? I'm going to pull that up over here. This is what it looks like on Tyrell N6. Now, let me think about how I want to discuss this for a second. I'm going to open the filter back up. I'm going to change my mind. Let's forget about the filter. We're going to just talk about the amplifier, which I spoke about earlier. That's volume, right? Right now, when I press the key, you hear sound. When I take my finger off the key, the sound goes away. Not that shocking, right? But it actually doesn't have to be that way. If we use an envelope, you'll notice something. It's doing the same thing, but we can start to shape that sound by using the same, and again, it's so cool that it's the exact same on this piece of new software, attack, decay, sustain, release, as it is on this old hardware. Attack, decay, sustain, release. Almost half a century old, and it's the exact same thing. So, what is sustain? Sustain is the ultimate volume. I know this is the counterintuitive thing. We're starting on the third letter, not the first or the second, but the third letter. There's a reason for that, but I'm acknowledging that it's counterintuitive at first right now. So again, just kind of go with me. If I turn sustain down, sorry, I needed to have the attack decay. I needed to start with all of these all the way down. If I leave sustain all the way up, it's going to behave the exact way before, which is that when I press the key, the sound is on, and when I take my finger off, the sound is gone. If I bring this down to halfway, it's just half volume. Quarter volume. So your sustain knob is actually your volume knob. This is a little counterintuitive, but that's because you have time to get to the volume and time to get away from the volume. And that's what attack and decay are. So let's start with attack. So with the sustain all the way up, let's say we want to make the sound softer. We don't want it to hit right away. We're going to increase the attack. Okay? Now, this is just a screenshot I have below, but if I was doing this with the plugin live, I'd be moving the attack slider up too. Now listen to this. Now that so sustain is all the way up. Just think of sustain as volume. I know, again, it's a little counterintuitive, but sustain is your volume. As I increase attack all the way down, it's instant. As I increase it, it fades in. DeCarmick asks a really great question. The Prophet 5 only has a low-pass filter. This synthesizer has only a low-pass filter. How do you keep excessive low end out of your sound with one? The answer is you don't. In a way, you can't. Without some sort of way to thin the sound out, you don't really have a great way to do it. Now, there's a couple of ways. Going back to the oscillator real quick, I'm going to answer this question real quick. When we went back to pulse width modulation, right, we could thin the sound out just by decreasing the pulse width. It's thinner than before. We could also use higher pitched oscillators, things like that. But the truth is, that's what's great about an analog synth, maybe, is just that it's going to be warm, right? Okay, so detour aside, going back, sustain, volume. Just think of the S as volume. I know it's sustain, but again, we could have called it attack, decay, volume release. Probably would have been better, more intuitive, but we called it attack, decay, sustain release for some reason. If I slow the attack down all the way, it takes a while for the sound to fade in. So what sort of sounds are like that? Well, the human voice can be like that, like in a choir where it's like, ah, right? It could be hard like, ha, right? Like just really in there, right? With the attack all the way down. But slowing it down, it's kind of nice. Strings are like that, the way they swell up beautifully and emotionally. This, guys, envelopes is where it gets good. Envelopes is where all the beauty, for me anyways, comes into the synthesizer. I love envelopes so much. So having a nice slow attack can be very beautiful. And this square wave is kind of giving that sort of flute type sound. If I move it over to the sine wave and just add a little bit of noise in, it's a very beautiful sound, the way it fades in. It's amazing to me how much volume can create emotion. It's so great. Now, you'll notice something kind of unnatural that's occurring right now, which is that as I take my fingers off, that sound just disappears instantly. And that's because we have no release. So the nice thing about ADSR is it's laid out how it happens, right? So attack, we're going to skip over decay for right now. Don't worry about it. Attack, sustain, release. If we just think about that, attack is the time it takes for the sound to appear when I hold the key down. Release is how long it takes for it to fade away. So it's the exact opposite of attack, which is really nice, easy way to think about it. Attack and release are opposites, and sustain's just the volume. So if the release is all the way down like it is, we don't hear anything. As I increase release, now it fades back out. On this synthesizer, the maximum attack and half release is the same amount of time. Tyrell N6 is going to be different. It's not the same thing as a vintage synthesizer, but a different vintage synthesizer could have a different value for those things. So it's not better or worse, it's just different. I'm going to speed these up a little bit just for the sake of this example. Really beautiful sort of fluty type sound to it, right? Now, there are certain types of sounds that crescendo. That's another one of those fancy Italian words. So what is a crescendo? A crescendo is a build. It's something that comes at you and then goes away, right? So if I go, wah, right? That crescendos. Now we can do that with decay. So decay is our tool to go from maximum volume down a little bit. So in this case, I'm going to bring the sustain, which is the volume. It's the final volume though, right? I'm going to bring it down to 50%. So with no decay time, it's going to sound exactly the same, but just half as loud. I lied. It doesn't sound exactly the same because it's going all the way up to the highest volume it can. So with a synthesizer, basically 99% of synthesizers, when the attack always goes to maximum volume and then comes down to the sustain volume. So this is another one of those counterintuitive things, but you can hear it here where it's going all the way up and then dropping to the sustain volume instantly because there's no decay. It's just dropping immediately like that. So let's add some attack. We'll add some decay to that, and you'll hear how now it goes from the max volume down to the sustain volume. But because the sustain volume's not zero, it sustains, and that's where the name sustain comes from, that as I hold the key down, it keeps going. It never goes all the way away. Now, if I bring the sustain all the way off, the sound will fade in and fade out to nothing, even though my finger's still on the key. Nothing. And so we can basically get all sorts of really interesting sounds off of this. The difference between decay and release, by the way, because someone out there might be like, wait, isn't that just release? Decay happens while your finger is on the key. Release is what happens when your finger's off the key. If there's no release, the moment I take my finger off the key, the sound's gone. Gone. Right? Oh, that little glitch there. Yeah, gone. It was a little quirk of analog gear is sometimes these sliders get a piece of dust in them or something like that, and it can actually kind of be on the wrong value. That's just the fun part of old gear. But see, it's instantaneous because there's no release. Even if I hold the key down, it'll fade back out. If I add some release and I take my finger off the key at the highest point, it's the same thing as the decay. Right? Does that make sense? Is everybody following so far? And yes, like Jim was just saying, when you release the key, that's when you get the release part of the envelope. So it's actually very simple when you think about it. It's a little counterintuitive the first time, but once you get going with this, man, this just starts to get really good. So you've got the attack stage, the time it takes to come in, decays the time it comes down while your finger's on the key, sustains the final level while your finger's on the key, and releases from the sustain level to 0 again, right? And it's a little, again, counterintuitive. So let's go over a couple of examples of different types of sounds. So we already did one of the best examples of this, which is decay, sustain, release all the way down and just attack. The sound will fade all the way up and then disappear. Really small amounts of this can be kind of fun. Right? It's kind of like a short staccato flute type sound. What's another great example? If I take attack you don't have to use attack. This is where we get the vast majority of synth sounds, in my opinion, actually come from not using attack, but using just decay, coming down to any number of sustain and release values. But let's just focus on decay for a second. So with no attack, we start to get these plucky type sounds. Most sounds in the world are plucks. Guitars are plucks. You pluck the string, it starts loud, and then it fades away. Piano, you press the key, a hammer strikes the string, it starts loud, and it fades away. Even a violin can sustain forever, but a lot of the times they come in, they crescendo, and then it sort of fades back. So not to nothing like on a guitar or piano. That's why we can add some sustain for more violin type sounds. But think about a brass instrument or a woodwind where a human being has to actually blow into the instrument, right? They're going to run out of air at some point. So it has to stop. So you have to bring the sustain all the way down to get a realistic brass or woodwind type sound. With a synth, you don't always want realism, but it is a thing. So, small amount of decay here. We get these little pluck type sounds. So, very small amount of decay, 0 attack, sustain, release. I'm moving over to a sawtooth wave just to make it a little bit more obvious. We get this very short sound, very percussive. We can get that to almost nothing. Almost nothing. Pretty much nothing there. You can't really hear what's going on. Slower amounts. We start to get into that piano guitar type territory where it's a pluck. And it sounds a little unnatural now when we take our fingers off. So let's just add some release in. Not even that much. We don't need much on this synth. So this is how we get a very natural plucky type shape. No attack. That's the secret for plucks. It's no attack. Now if we want more of a crescendo, we just add some attack in. You're starting to hear with this one how it has this vocally type tone again. It could be a very fast sort of brass sound too. If we increase some sustain, we sort of get into more of this string brass territory. Yeah, it's Bill says like an oboe, right? And that's all of the different types of sounds we could get are going to come from what's going on with really the oscillators at this point. So let's say we wanted to do like strings. It's going to be going back to when someone asked earlier, what are some of my favorite combos? 2 sawtooth waves. And we're just going to detune them a bit. Now we have like this sharp bow sound, like a pretty sharp staccato-y sort of sound. If we want to slow that down, we can increase the sustain and the attack a bit, and now we'll get a slower attack. And so that's how we could get these big swelling string type sounds. ADSR is like Alex drinking a beer. Attack is how quickly the beer meets his lips. Decay is the speed at which he raises the beer at an angle to pour the beer. Release is how long he drinks. Oh, and then the burp is release afterwards. It's very accurate. It's foaming up on me. So this is how we could get sort of a string type sound. Okay, so far, we've just been applying the envelope to the amplifier, which on this synth is this volume knob over here. What if we apply the envelope to the filter? I've got a handy switch here, which allows me to just move the amplifier, it says VCA here, voltage controlled amplifier, to what's called a gate. Don't worry about that too much. What it basically is doing is telling the synth, okay, forget what's going on with the envelope over here and go back to just note on and off with the amplifier. So if I press the key now when it's in gate mode and I take my finger off, it's gone. The reason I want to do that is so we can use the envelope on the filter so we can hear how that sounds. The same way that we heard how the LFO sounds on the oscillators versus the filter. An envelope is mostly used on either the amplifier or the filter. Not so much on the oscillators, although you can use it for pitch, but most of the time it's used on either the filter or the amplifier. So I'm going to put the amplifier just in a mode where it's on off. That's called gate. So that we can play with the envelope with the filter. So to hear what the envelope is doing, we need to bring the cutoff frequency down because the envelope adds to the cutoff frequency. And so by bringing that down, let's bring it down. Back to where it basically becomes a sine wave. We have a little movement in because of the detune, which is nice. Now, as we increase the envelope amount here, which if we go back to the filter section on Tyrell N6, you'll see, that was the wrong one. What am I doing here? Here we go. The ADSR here, that's the first mod source. So it's amazing how we've basically got mod 1 and mod 2 here on this analog synth. It's the same thing from the ADSR or the LFO, right? So as I increase this, it's going to apply that same shape that we had for the volume to the filter. So in the same way that because we have some attack and decay, it's coming in and coming down to the sustain level, we're getting that same behavior on the filter. Now, if I bring the attack and decay and the sustain the sustain all the way down and just use attack and decay, release all the way down, it's basically one shot of the LFO. So it just does it once. And again, that's what's so great about an envelope is it happens every time you press the key. But it does it once. It doesn't do this cyclical thing that doesn't just keep going. So if I put the LFO back on, you'll hear it keeps going, right? Which is okay, but I want to hear it just happen once. It actually sounds really good on an analog synth, this type of sound, opening and closing. Vowel-y types of sounds. Now, if we take the attack out, we're going to get more of that pluck shape again. And you could hear here, we're starting to get something that sounds a lot kind of like a bass guitar, right? Because it's a deep sound and we have some closing of the filter. So when you think about when a guitar string is struck or a piano string, right? Not only does the volume decay, but it's also the tone changes over time. So at the start of the string attack, it's very bright, and then it fades away. It goes like bow, 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 right? When you're playing a guitar. So we're getting a really great, this is the recipe for a synth bass sound, is actually a little bit of envelope, no attack envelope, but some decay, low sustain. That's going to be your filter, your synth bass sound. Right? If you've heard that one before, it's probably a little bit more envelope on there. When I say more envelope, I'm just saying adding more of that envelope amount to the filter. With it all the way off, we're just getting the filter at the cutoff frequency, but as I add it, we get a brighter sound that fades to dark. So it starts bright. If I emphasize the decay a lot, you'll hear this. Then fades to dark. So again, it's just automatically. By the way, if I just do this with my hand, that's decay, right? Starting bright and going dark. Or I could do it with the envelope automatically for me. So if it's too slow and I'm playing too fast, it's just as though the filter is all the way open. So we need to tighten it up a bit. So it sounds so freaking good, right? And don't forget, we could add resonance to this and get more of that type of sound. So this is how this sounds now that we're using the envelope. So we've lost some of the low end, but in this case, if we were going for that New Order Blue Monday sound, they did use some resonance, which sort of emphasizes the mid-range. That's how they did that. They did it on a Moog Source. I've actually compared the Moog Source from 1981 or 2 or so to this synth. They sound really freaking close. That's a live stream we did back in the day, a couple of years ago, maybe. And so that's how that works. Now, we could do this same type of sound, but just add some attack to it, and we're going to get a new sound. I wouldn't say it's a synth bass sound, but it could be a synth bass sound. Now, if we bring that amount down again, we can get into that dubstep sort of wub type sound. Oh, that sounds mean. And again, these lower types of resonant sounds are very vowel-y. So this is the basis of a lot of those dubstep type sounds, not using an LFO, but instead using the envelope to get a similar sound. We could slow it down even more for those types of sounds. If I add some delay on, just adding some space to it. Could be a really great sort of sound. Also, we could take this up some octaves. So again, I'm just bringing the tune up of the oscillators, and then we can kind of, by increasing the cutoff, it'll be a little too low right now. We can actually take it into almost like a little harmonica sort of lead type sound. This is sort of like almost like a Pink Floyd-y sort of 70s synth lead type sound. Damien asks, is it possible for synths like this to do a kick drum sound? And the answer is yes. And I'll show you how to do it because it's applicable to what we're doing right now. So let's go back down. Let's get a really low note because a kick drum's low, right? I'm going to use square waves for this. Square waves can sound good for a kick drum, but you can do it with a sawtooth wave too. I'm going to kill the attack, and I'm going to decrease the decay aggressively until it's very tight. And you'll notice it's starting to kind of sound like a kick drum. Now, this is the basis for like a UK bass or tech house bass type sound, is using square waves and a very fast attack with some resonance. It's got this great knock, so this is great for house music. Something like that. That's a sort of a useful sound. This is sort of taking us into this. Now I need to bring the cutoff even lower. And now it's starting to get really kick drummy. We can increase the amount. To taste. So we're sort of tuning our kick drum now to give us that. If we increase the resonance, we sort of get a more techno kick drum. Oh yeah, you know, that's going to take you kind of into that territory. A little less resonance. Somewhere around there, you could sample that and actually use that as a kick drum. Now, we have one more trick we could use actually, which is to route the envelope to the oscillator pitch. So right now, we're routing the envelope only to the filter with a lot of resonance. And we're getting the kind of the sound of the beater hitting the top of the kick drum from the resonance. But we could do it with oscillator pitch as well. So how would we do that? Just over here, increase mod. On Tyrell N6, there's in the oscillator mod section. I thought it was over there. Where is it? Oh, I think you can use ADSR 2 here, which is the envelope to the pitch of the oscillators. But it's the same idea. We're going to just take that shape and actually apply it to the pitch of the oscillator, and you'll hear it start to fall. Now, because it's being processed by the filter too, you're not hearing too much other than... So I'm going to open the filter all the way up so you can hear the difference. So the filter all the way up, square wave, right? Lots of square waves, very thick square wave sound. As I apply modulation, oh, that's applying LFO pitch. Sorry, I misunderstood that. I can I do that? Might not. I think I just can't do it on this synth. Maybe? Modulator. Yeah, so on this synth I can't do it. I forgot about this synth. This is the dangers of doing this live. So on this synth I have a feature called auto bend. So you can actually do it on Tyrell N6. On this one, it only goes up in pitch, which is super cool. You can hear that effect. You can hear it. It's going up to that pitch, right? But you can't do it the other way. You can't get it to fall. So that would be the trick with a kick drum. Oh well, I can't do it on this synth. It's almost half a century old. So that's one feature that they've added to newer synths that's not on this particular one. However, there are synths from the time that could do it, just not this one. So anyways, we now have the VCF as we bring it down. With this nice pluck type sound, which is, again, if we add some delays, we get some really beautiful sorts of trancey type sounds out of this. Oh, that's very cool, isn't it? And then as we add envelope amount, so much of trance music is based around plucks. This is a very percussive type sound. Now it might sound like the sound is sustaining, but you'll notice there's no sustain here. So what's happening? What's happening is the cutoff frequency is not all the way down. If I bring the cutoff frequency all the way down, the sustain point is 0. There's just nothing really coming through, right? But if I bring the cutoff frequency up halfway, there's no sustain on the envelope. But again, in this configuration, the envelope is adding to the cutoff frequency. So you can think of it as only moving the knob automatically for me up, but never below. So even with no sustain, it will stop at the halfway point because that's where the cutoff frequency is. And again, the sound is sustaining because we have the VCA on gate. What the gate just means is while the key's on, you hear sound. While the key's off, there's no sound. I mean, at this point, guys, if you followed this far, you've essentially passed the bachelor's degree in analog synths. You know how to make everything. Now it's just how you apply multiple of these things all at once. There are a few things we haven't covered, of course, but it's pretty much it, right? We're going to apply some envelopes to the filters, the amplifier, the oscillator, some LFOs to those things as well. Beautiful sound. We increase the decay further. We get this great sound, but now I'm missing the release, right? Now on this synthesizer, now this is a thing about some modern synths, but especially vintage synths. These things were expensive back then, right? This synth was a lot of money when it came out. Even though this was an affordable synth at the time, it was still way more expensive than what we're used to spending on synths nowadays, right? And a lot of people would say synths nowadays are too expensive, right? It is what it is. So there's only one envelope on the synth. Now, if we look at Tyrell N6, as well as many other synthesizers, right? A lot of them will have an envelope for the amplifier, the voltage controlled amplifier. So it says envelope 1 to the VCA. And the envelope 2 will be for other things. The filter primarily, but in something like N6, you could route it someplace else. And I almost thought I could route this envelope to the oscillator as well. So when we go back to the filter, you'll notice that it says the sources, it says ADSR 2. That's because ADSR 1 is going to the volume always. Now on my old analog synth, right, almost half a century old, she only has one envelope because it was expensive to put extra parts in the synth. So they thought, we could get away with just one envelope. So it's always sharing this one envelope. So if I want to use an envelope, I can either route it to the filter, the VCA, or both. But I don't have a separate envelope for the amplifier and filter. And that's where you can get even more complex sounds with something like Tyrell N6 and a lot of modern analog synths too, by the way. But I encourage you to try using one envelope for both the filter and the amplifier. Most of the time, that's all you need. In the way you could do this with the plugin, if you're following along, is just keep the values the same. So in the same way that in the graphic below me, the attacks both at 0, decays at 50, sustain is at 100, and release is at 25%, just do the same thing, right? Keep the values the same, and it's as though you're using one envelope, right? I actually don't know what SH stands for. I used to, but now I don't. Insomnia Noir says this was $450 in 1979, which doesn't sound like that much, which would have been $2,100 today. So that's very expensive for a monosynth nowadays. But actually, there are some monosynths that cost $2,100 nowadays. Synthesizer. Yeah, sorry if I'm starting to slur. On that note, let's drink more mezcal. Can I get a scum cheers in the chat for everybody who's been following along on this video so far? I really appreciate you guys. Oh. Welcome to the channel if this is your first time here. I hope you'll like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. I've been hearing that people have said they haven't seen my videos as much. Hit the notification bell so that you see. I don't post a whole lot. Usually a live stream a week, maybe a video here and there. So I try not to annoy people. Thank you guys so much for the scum cheers there. Everybody who's got those custom emojis down there that you're seeing fly across the screen, they're members of this channel. Those are people who actually give their money, the cost of a beer or a cup of coffee every month to help support me make the content that I do. And I just want to say thank you to you guys for making this possible. If you've got a little bit of extra money to buy me a beer, please consider becoming a member of this channel if you found this video helpful. It helps me keep making videos like these. So anyways, let's see what happens when we apply the filter to the envelope. So I'm going to move just the amplifier from being controlled by the gate, which means just on off, to envelope. And now the volume and the filter are being controlled by the envelope. So let's hear the difference. I'll play it because it's been a little bit with just the gate on like before. If I put it to envelope, now we'll hear what it sounds. I'll turn the delay down a bit too. So now it's moving the cutoff frequency and the volume knob at the same time. If I increase the attack, it'll fade in both the filter and the amplifier, the volume at the same time. We can make some very beautiful sounds by doing a very fast version of this. You've heard this sound before too, right? You've heard this at some point. If we add some attack and release, now the filter will close at the same time the sound is fading away after I've taken my fingers off the keys. Let's add some more sustain, a little more cutoff frequency. A little less cutoff frequency. So, a lot of the times, you want to use the envelope on the filter and the amplifier to get a natural sound. Because if I'm using the gate, I'm never really going to have release. So on certain sounds, like a bass guitar or synth bass, I don't really need release. It's kind of nice to I don't need it. And when you use the gate mode, it's a very powerful sound because it's just all on or all off. So that's good for those types of sounds. But for these types of sounds, using the envelope on both is really wonderful. So this is how we get into sort of the brassier territory. So I'm going to go back to Sawtooth Wave. And I always think 50% sustain is really a good place for a brass sound. So I'm going to do like 25, 25, 50, 25. Now, if you're doing this on Tyrell, you might get different sounds because, again, the amount of time that it's tuned on Tyrell N6 is different than on this old vintage synth. There's no international standard for how long max attack should be. Every synthesizer is different. But I think with this, you can get sounds that sound extremely, extremely similar to 99% similar with the plugin to this. Husker, this is not the exact synth that was used in Stranger Things, although they might have used this one, but if you mean the one that was used on the theme song, that was an Oberheim 2 voice. So we're getting into that brassy territory. I think we need a little bit more cutoff and add a little bit more resonance. So resonance is a big part of how we simulate sounds too, because if the resonance, it kind of can take you into a different territory. DeCarmick asked earlier, hey, if I've only got a low pass filter, how can I get excessive low end out? Well, actually resonance kind of works to do that. Versus if I have it all the way down, it's a very full sound. A little more resonance, it's a lot thinner. You can compensate by bringing the volume up a bit. This would be a great point to bring in a little bit of our delayed LFO vibrato. Need very little. So this is adding a little bit more movement and stopping it from sounding so static, That's what it's all about, is adding subtle amounts of this. So, for instance, right now I've got the amount the envelope is affecting the filter all the way open. Let's bring it down to halfway and see how that affects things. So I don't know exactly what instrument I'm emulating here. Let's change the waveforms out to some pulse width modulation and some noise. That's getting a little scratchy. I don't know what's going on with that. All right, we'll try something else for now. Just pulse width modulation. Let's bring the attack down. Now we can create more of a pluck. If we space out and increase the tuning on one oscillator, we get more of a bell. So let's bring the sustain all the way down. See, that's kind of how we can get a bell type sound, you know. Right? It's got that kind of bell, and it's by spacing out the octaves on some square waves because they have that more hollow sound, right? So what other things could we do? Well, on this synthesizer and on Tyrell N6, we could do this as well. We can actually invert the mode. So if we go negative on that modulation amount, or on this synth, we just flip the envelope upside down. So this whole time I've been talking about how cutoff adds. Well, what if the envelope subtracted from the cutoff amount? Does that make sense? So this whole time, I said that weird. The envelope is adding to the cutoff frequency, also known as it's moving this up. But what if it's only moving down? What kind of sounds could we get? Well, the same sound, but down, sounds like this now. Almost to me has a bit of like a steel drum type sound. Interestingly, if we add attack, it's going to start sounding like decay because it's falling down. So we can get different types of synth sounds that have never been heard before in like a natural space by using a negative envelope. But they're beautiful. I mean, if you play some... really kind of interesting different types of sounds. So that's some options, some things to play with. Going back to a positive shape here. I think I saw someone say this earlier. I'm going to put this into the amplifier into gate mode. So the envelope's only affecting the filter. Let's slow this really down. And use a lot of resonance and a lot of the envelope. This is how we can create like a filter sweep type sound automatically. So a lot of sweeps use these like high resonance amounts. So pads will also often use a lot of these. If I put the envelope back on, it'll sound like this. Let's add some release so it's nice and squelchy. So a lot of famous synth sounds sort of sound like this, where we're in this territory, because it's high resonance sound. That's, you don't really get that. Really beautiful squelchy type sounds. Bill asks, can you explain key follow? Right? So key follow over here on Tyrell N6 or this knob. I did explain this earlier. but we'll make it real quick. If I just turn the envelope off, so now there's no automatic movement from the envelope. And I turn keyboard follow off or key follow off on Tyrell N6. The cutoff frequency is fixed. So no matter what note I play, the cutoff is the same. And even if I play really high notes, they're basically going to disappear. So what's happening is the notes are going higher than the cutoff frequency, so you can't hear them anymore because they're being cut off. So to fix that, you don't always want to fix it, but in this case, if I want to fix that, I can add some keyboard follow amount or this fader in Tyrell N6. And basically what's happening is, as I play higher on the keyboard, it's also telling the synth to move the cutoff knob higher automatically. So it's just another way to automatically do something. Yeah. And something like the SH, yeah, that's why I picked the SH, is because it's actually laid out very, very similar to Tyrell N6. And it's kind of like the perfect synthesizer. It's what I love about this synth, is it basically has everything you could want, right? But it's a very compact, very simple thing. And it's beautiful for that reason. We got one more concept to cover, basically, tonight. And that's Portamento. So we've got this sound going. No envelope affecting anything. Just keyboard tracking and a lot of resonance. And it sounds great, because that's a great thing about an analog synth, is that resonance is just so gooey. Now, Tyrell N6, great plugin. Really accurate analog emulation type sound. Really can sound authentic. Not all plugins are as good as Tyrell N6. Behringer, for instance, makes a free analog synth emulation plugin that sucks. I'm not talking about all of Behringer tonight, but that particular plugin is terrible. Just use Tyrell N6 or Disco DSP's OBXD. Those are great. So, Portamento is like the last feature we haven't really covered here. And what Portamento does is it just slows down the voltage from the keys to the oscillators. Now, that might be a little counterintuitive when I say it to you, but when you hear it, you'll understand. So I'm going to just play an octave. And if I add a little Portamento, it makes it glide between the notes. So this is sort of similar to using an LFO or something, in the sense that it's affecting the pitch of the oscillators. But in this case, it's just slowing down the amount. So let's turn the envelope back on for the amplifier, as well as adding some from the VCF. And so we're getting some slide, some glide to it. And now we have one more thing, I'm sorry I lied, that I want to cover on the synthesizer. And we'll pretty much have covered everything on it, which is gate versus gate for this mono mode, legato mode. You're going to see legato a lot on a lot of modern synths. But if I put it to gate mode, which is the on-off from before, what that's going to do is it's going to tell the envelope not to retrigger when I'm still holding down a previous note, because you can play more than one note. You can hold down more than one note at a time. Let me retry that sentence with a little bit more mezcal in my system. I think that'll help me speak. So, can I get some scum cheers in the chat? If I hold down more than one key at a time, I've only got one voice to play with. There are synths that can play more than one note at a time. That's a synth called a polysynth. This is a mono synth because it's only got one voice. More than one note that can be played at a time. You could have 2, 4, 6, 8 voices. You can play 8 notes at a time if you have an 8-voice synth, right? I love you guys so much. When you move it from, on this synth, it's called gate and trigger. On other synths, it might be, you put it into legato mode by putting it just in the gate. Now, if I play more than one note, the envelope will do its thing, its movement, but it's only going to do it once until I've taken my fingers off the keys and I press another note. So here's originally. If I do faster sounds, it's more obvious. If I hold down and do the same thing, you'll notice that nothing's happened, right? If I move it into gate mode, oh, that's what's happening. So you can hear it occurring. Not really noticing a huge difference here. I think it's the same on this synth. I don't really know what I'm doing wrong there. It might just be on this synth. This is also, so this is such an old synth that if you're holding down a note to the left, it'll cancel out a note to the right. Most modern synths aren't like that. So I might be doing something kind of stupid here, or I might be getting a little blacked out on mezcal. I'm not sure what the answer is, but some synths will let you use the envelope to re-trigger some things. I think this fuck up is a great place to end tonight's live stream. I know we've gone a little bit long. This was a fun one, guys. I hope this was helpful for some beginners out there. Some moderately intermediate people as well might have picked up a thing or two. It's always great to hear the sound of a vintage synthesizer from the 70s. So if you guys have any questions in the future, please drop them as comments in the chat. I really appreciate that. Yeah, go till you actually black out. I'm glad you enjoyed it, FD. You encouraged me to do a video like this about a year or maybe even more ago, and that was a very useful video for a lot of people. And so I wanted to do it again because we've done it before with just software. This time I wanted to do it with a hardware, real analog synth from the 70s, but then also have the graphics up for the modern thing, because you can see it's all right there. And Tyrell N6 just sounds sick. It's so good. Named after the Tyrell Corporation from the movie Blade Runner. It's a great sounding synthesizer, but it also works almost exactly the same way as a synthesizer from the 70s does. So I just want to say a huge thank you. What's buzzing more, the SH-2 or me? I am, for sure. I definitely don't drink as much mezcal nowadays as I did back then. So anyways, guys, I hope you had some fun tonight. I know I did. And hopefully, if this is your first time on this channel, you've liked and subscribed because we do something involving synthesizers every week. I think we're going to check out the Roland JX8P next week, run it through the legendary synthesizer test. That's the plan as of right now. Also, I'm going to have a video up soon on some deep sound design with the JX10, recreating one of my favorite sounds ever from this record. This record here. This is a hard trance record from 2004. Never End by Yoji Biomechanica. So I recreate a sound, one of my favorite sounds ever from this, in a video. That's going to be for members only, coming up this week probably. So we've got some cool stuff going on. Thank you guys for hanging out so late. I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a fantastic evening, and I will see you next week. Continue to be excellent.